Welcome to VAPC, Varsity Acres Presbyterian Church, on this Saturday afternoon on the long weekend. And we have a few who are gathered here with us at VAPC. We know that some of you are joining online as well. There will be an opportunity during our question period to ask questions. You can do that with the live chat. And of course, we will have questions from the floor as well. Before we get started, I think it is important that we acknowledge we live on a land that is not ours. In a spirit of truth and reconciliation, we acknowledge that we are here in the ancestral territory of the Siksika, the Blackfoot Confederacy, home of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, and in the traditional territory of the Yatsenakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. This territory is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta and lies within the historical Métis homeland of the Northwest Territories. We acknowledge that we have often been unaware of our impact on the First Peoples of this land, and unaware of our unexamined attitudes and ideas about our history and our present relations with them. We confess our participation in the legacy of colonization, which continues today, and we commit ourselves to listen and to learn from them as we seek a new relationship with them. Again, welcome to VAPC. It is my honor today to introduce the moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Reverend Dr. Bob Ferris has had a varied career in ministry, from academics to pastoral ministry to congregational ministry to church camps. He has been involved internationally and nationally, and at this past June General Assembly, he was elected moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Bob has so much to bring to this role. I think the first time that I met him was actually, we were involved in a intercultural exchange at the Protestant seminary in Matanzas, Cuba. And I think that was my first meeting with Bob. I've had opportunities to run into him from time to time over the years since then. And most recently, of course, when he was co-convener of the Rainbow Communion. It is my pleasure to welcome Bob here to VAPC and to the Presbytery of Calgary-MacLeod. For all of those of you who are watching from around the Presbytery, Bob, welcome.
Thanks so much, Greg, and for the warm welcome. Thanks to all of you that I greeted as you were coming in and had a chance to be introduced to and chat to, and I hope for those that I didn't get that opportunity to do so, we can meet afterward as well, and also to encourage you to ask questions. I'll speak for a short time, but I look forward to the dialogue that we can have together and any questions that you might have. I thank you for the invitation to be here from the Presbytery of Calgary-MacLeod, and I bring you greetings from the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I'm happy to be with you and have conversation with you about the life of our church. I want to do a little bit of reflection on the assembly itself, and then on my moderatorial year, and then, as I said, I'd like to open things up for dialogue. My intent of my visit here is to hear from you and to know what you are doing in discerning God's will for your future here in this part of God's realm. As you know, once again, the General Assembly met online this year. This was the second time that we had done that, and we clearly had learned a few things through COVID and through that first online General Assembly. And from my perspective, at least, things worked pretty well from the techno side of things. I want to assure you that that had nothing to do with me. I would have messed it up completely if I'd been responsible for that. But I think it worked well, and I was very fortunate to have Stephen Kendall with me, the clerk of the General Assembly, principal clerk of the General Assembly, let me get that right, and to benefit from his experience and from his skill. He's been doing this for a long time, and he was also at the first one. So whenever I needed some help, Stephen was right there at my side. I had my little button that I could push to, it didn't cut people off, it allowed me to speak. But when I spoke, that overrode anyone else speaking. So I had a little bit of a power trip with that little button sitting right there. I tried not to use it too often. But Stephen was a great help, and to interpret and to understand when things might be in order or not in order, or if I had to intervene in some way. It was great also to have Victor Kim with us. Victor has begun now as the new principal clerk of the General Assembly. I think it was helpful for him to be there, to be learning on the job, and it was great for me to be able to have conversation with him and to interact with him, get to know his style, because he's the person I'll be working with over this year. As I understand it, Victor is in Calgary right now, and that his father, I think, is in palliative care, and he is here with him. So let's hold Victor in our prayers today. I think it's good that we're going to be meeting again, as long as all goes well, in person next year in the General Assembly. But my personal opinion is that we need to be looking at a hybrid model where we would at least alternate between online and in-person assemblies. For one reason, for the sake of stewardship and efficiency, and another for making the work of the assembly more accessible to different people of different ages and stages, and people from across the country. As in every General Assembly, there were particular issues that took up a lot of the energy of the assembly. We are still very much living out the implications of the decisions of the previous assembly, the recommendations of the Rainbow Communion that were all passed, and also the 2 remits that were passed that allowed for same-sex marriage and also for the ordination of people in same-sex relationships. I have to say I was really saddened by the intensity of feeling of those who felt that there is no longer a place for them in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. There was a very difficult debate on the recommendation from the Assembly Council that outlined the process for those who wish to leave the denomination. I hope that my year as moderator, visiting and being in dialogue with Presbyterians across the country and internationally, can reassure people that all are still welcome in our church. There is change, for sure. And for those of us who identify as 2S LGBTQI+, these changes are life-giving and long overdue. There's a place at the table for us now. But there is still a place at the table for those who do not agree with the changes around marriage and ordination. There will continue to be diversity of opinion around these decisions, but space has been created for those with an opinion that's different from mine and from the majority of people in the Presbyterian Church. I believe that there still is opportunity to work together and to proclaim good news in a world that finds itself struggling to experience peace and love and grace and forgiveness and wholeness and justice. This has also been a part of the discussion of the special committee that's now working, Re-Overtures 1 and 2, from the Hancock Presbyteries. In the debates in the Assembly, however, I think we broadened the parameters of the discussion around racism. I strongly agree with the decision of the Assembly to allow this committee to continue its work for another year and to widen its mandate. Like the discussion around human sexuality, hearing stories of harm done and really coming to terms with racism in the denomination is critical to us. I've made a decision to join all the meetings of the special committee and hopefully make a contribution from the work that we have done with Rainbow Communion, as well as my experience in working in multicultural and intercultural ministry with the Canadian Churches Forum for Global Ministries, as well as in my own experiences in Canada and in Southern Africa. At the Assembly, we received the historic first report of the Indigenous Ministries Council with a recommendation that urged us to take seriously the need to look at faith and life from an Indigenous perspective. As we move forward on the journey of truth-telling and possibilities of reconciliation, this is essential. This, too, has been a very long journey for our church. I think there are some who thought that the confession in 1994 around residential schools was the end, was the resolution to this question. Instead, it was only a first step, and our Indigenous siblings are articulating very clearly some of the next steps that need to be taken. I'm making the relationship with Indigenous people a focus of my moderatorial year and intend, where possible, to meet with Indigenous people and communities on my journeys, and wherever possible to do this with members of local presbyteries and local congregations. Again, in the Assembly, I was reminded of the immense amount of work that is done by our various Assembly committees and by our very hardworking national staff. The consensus way of dealing with recommendations, I think, is good in moving us through the business of the Assembly more quickly. But it means that we do not hear more fully and talk about the work of the church, that the church is engaged in Canada and around the world. An elder in my congregation at St. Andrew's, King Street in Toronto, who was a commissioner to this assembly, was blown away to hear about all of the important and good work that we do as a denomination. Well, after a flurry of activity at the end of June around the participation of Presbyterians in the Pride Parade in Toronto, and there were about 100 of us who participated, I have been a bit quieter over the summer months until this past week. Last Saturday, I flew here to Calgary and was honored to speak at the citywide Interfaith Pride service at Scarborough United Church on Sunday. The service was recorded and it's available online if you wish to see it and listen to what I had to say there. I'm joining with Presbyterians and people from other faith communities to watch the Pride Parade together this Sunday, and that's tomorrow. I'm getting my days all clouded here. I think it's telling, although I think it was a very wrong decision, that the Pride Committee in Calgary has banned the participation of any faith group in marching in the parade, since all of us, or almost all of us, are not absolutely and fully inclusive. I think that is very unfortunate indeed. For some young people who identify as 2S LGBTQI+, and also for some people who are not so young anymore, it is sometimes seeing people from their church marching in the parade that has allowed them to begin to deal with the guilt and the shame that they have felt, particularly in relation to religion. and to help them move away from a path of self-hatred, addiction, self-harm, and even suicide. I had a very important experience on Monday this past week when I was invited to sit in a circle at Grace Church here in Calgary with Indigenous elders and leaders in conversation about the repatriation of the Manitou stone from the Royal Alberta Museum and back into the stewardship of Indigenous peoples. This concern had been brought to the Assembly through an overture from Grace Church. I'm grateful for the work of Chandra Mannix in bringing us together and for the invitation and the patience of leaders like Chief Leonard Weasel Traveler, former Chief Blaine Favell, and Elder Fred Campio, who were willing to tell us their story and of their commitment to this project. The stone is the largest meteorite ever found in Canada. And it's sacred to Indigenous people and traditionally had been a place where nations gathered to meet and to seek peace and to seek reconciliation. When it was stolen by a Methodist missionary in the late 19th century, Indigenous leaders prophesied the demise of the buffalo and the disastrous consequences that followed for them. The current project has brought together Indigenous people from various territories, and as was emphasized on Monday, it was the impetus that brought us together in that circle to talk and to seek reconciliation together. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to have met the stone at the Royal Alberta Museum, together with Clayton Kootenai, who's the CEO of the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Centre, and to have met with members of Edmonton Lakeland Presbytery this week. I had the opportunity yesterday, as I was driving back to Calgary, to have a stop at Camp Canawan and to have some conversation with members of the summer staff. Tomorrow, I'm delighted that I'm going to be preaching at Westminster Presbyterian Church here in the city, and then heading to the parade. And I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to have met so many friends and colleagues over the course of these 10 days, and to have been so warmly welcomed here in Alberta. You set the stage well for my year, and I'm looking forward to continuing this journey across Canada and internationally. Plans are being made for me to visit our partner church, the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan, in the spring. I'm also looking forward to meeting with ecumenical partners in Canada through the Canadian Council of Churches annual Church Leaders Gathering. And I have the opportunity in 2 weeks' time to meet with the new moderator of the United Church of Canada, the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne. I'll just say now that I wish you God's richest blessing in your worship and your work and your witness here, and I will continue to pray for you throughout this year, as I hope you will pray for me. And I do welcome your questions and the conversation that we can have together. And as Greg said earlier, both those of you who are present here in the sanctuary today and for those who are online. I don't know where I look to say hello to the people online.
Right up there.
Right up there. Okay, hello and welcome to you all as well.
Well, we are taking questions from the floor. We already have 4 questions from those who are, well, we already have some questions. Okay, we have something going on live stream, but we are taking questions from the floor. But we're going to start with one of our pre-submitted questions. During the Pope's visit, there were references to the Doctrine of Discovery. Not knowing anything about it, I Googled it. In the process, I stumbled on an excellent film called Doctrine of Discovery, Stolen Lands, Strong Hearts, produced by the Anglican Church of Canada, which covers the relationship with Indigenous peoples since the arrival of Columbus. What really stuck in my mind was a comment by an Anglican archbishop who called the relationship arrogance of the worst kind. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, arrogance is an unpleasant way of behaving as if you are better or more important than other people. Christianity today is fractured to such an extent that it can no longer speak with a unified voice. Each denomination gives the impression that they are better or more important than somebody else. For example, when I go to another church as a Presbyterian, I may not be able to participate fully. This, to me, is not humility. It's a good example of what religion is not supposed to be. As I think about it, arrogance in today's world is much more dominant than humility, which produces better results. I would very much like to hear your comments. And so we thank you, Ernie, for that question, and we welcome your comments, Bob.
That's about an hour's worth of comments, I think, right there. Thank you, Ernie, for the question and for your reflections. I think that's very important to hear. So let's start with the doctrine of discovery. I think most of us were never aware of that doctrine or that being part of our doctrine in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I encountered it first in the work I did on my PhD about Portuguese colonialism in southern Africa, and particularly in Mozambique. And the Portuguese were in southern Africa because of that very doctrine, and the papal bull in the late 15th century, I believe it was, after the Portuguese began exploring, as they understood it, down the west coast of Africa. So the Spanish, of course, were also interested in exploring and exploiting, and other European nations were as well. And the encounter with different peoples in the lands where they went was a bit problematic for them. What was to be their relationship with those people, and could they do anything with them in order to have possession or to exploit the land that they were in or do whatever? So the Pope issued a bull that said that the world would be divided in half, and anything to the east of the line would be Spanish territory, and anything to the west would be Portuguese territory. Now that was leaving out all the other European nations. They were okay. They didn't belong to the Spanish or the Portuguese. So that's why, in fact, Brazil speaks Portuguese, because the line went down through about halfway through modern-day Brazil. So that was Portuguese, and everything on the other side was to be Spanish. So yes, talk about arrogance, and that one person can just divide the world and give it away to two different nations, and both of which were considered to be Christian and with Christian monarchs. So that meant that they were able to either forcibly convert the peoples that they encountered, or it was fine to just exterminate them, to eliminate them, because they weren't Christian. They weren't part of the Christian world. And the world has been living with that since that time. That was the first real justification for European expansion, and for the churches to have this idea that it was not only their obligation to evangelize, but also to forcibly convert people to Christianity. And so it's said that doctrine has infused the work of not only the Roman Catholic Church, but also the Protestant churches, any churches that are engaged in mission and have been engaged in mission in that kind of colonial project that's dominated the world for 500 or 600 years now. And it was at the base of how we as Canadians understood mission as well. Perhaps not quite as brutally at some times, but as we were finding out with the residential schools, brutal in our own way. And it really is the height of arrogance to say that we know best. And through the power that we hold, we will force you, either force you or to become us, like us, or exterminate you. And not only was that at the base of the work of the churches, but also at the base of the work of nation building. Think of our own country and our relationship with Indigenous people and how we claim to have sovereignty in this country. It was by conquest and then by treaty, which often was not very well adhered to. So it has become, as the relationship with Indigenous people in Canada has become more apparent, and we've been doing more talking, and there's been the revelations about the residential schools and the confessions of the churches, it's been important to deal with what's behind that. And that's dealing with things like the Doctrine of Discovery and also what's called terra nullius. I'll test your Latin there, but it's really empty land. And so the lands that European explorers and missionaries came to were considered to be empty, that there was no one really living here because there were no Christians living here. So that's again part of the justification of what happened in the settlement of this part of the world and lots of other parts of the world as well. So the churches, many of the churches have begun dealing with that. 2 years ago, not this past assembly, but the assembly before, we as a church renounced both the Doctrine of Discovery and terra nullius. So we've taken a step, at least, to say we recognize that these were wrong and that they stand in the way of a right relationship, as our Indigenous siblings might say. And then he was talking about the Pope's visit, and there were many of us who were hoping that this would be the time when the Roman Catholic Church as well would renounce these doctrines. And that would have had particular significance because of where they began, and also shown another step along the way of reconciliation between the Roman Catholic Church and Indigenous people and survivors of residential schools in Canada. That didn't happen. I personally would say that I was very disappointed that that didn't happen. I hope that that's on the agenda with the Roman Catholic Church. I think it has been. I haven't had opportunity to speak with anyone from the Bishops' Conference in Canada yet. Probably at the church leaders meeting in January, we may address that. And again, it would be the height of arrogance for me to say what the Roman Catholic Church should do. But from our perspective, there's great hope that they would also move on renouncing these doctrines and to help us get onto a different kind of footing in our relationship with Indigenous people.
Thank you so much, Bob. We would like to welcome questions from the floor, so your question doesn't have to be as considered as Ernie's and thought out. It can be a simple question. It can be a question about where the church is at, something that you've always wondered about Presbyterianism or the church in general. Bob is here for your questions. So are there any questions from the floor? You can just come on up to this mic.
You mentioned that, excuse me, some of the, at this assembly about the, not fallout, but ongoing controversy surrounding some of the Rainbow Communion recommendations. For those of us that weren't at Assembly and didn't hear that, would you be able to highlight a couple of the issues that are most present for the church, or what we heard was most present for parts of the church?
Okay. I think the strongest ongoing conversation and conflict, I would say, within the church focuses on the remits rather than the recommendations of Rainbow Communion, but I'll say a bit about both. For just maybe to give a little more background, so the two remits, just raise your hand if you have any idea at all what a remit is. Okay, a little bit. Let me say a little bit about that. So it's all Presbyterian polity in the way we do things. So there were some overtures that came to the Assembly from different presbyteries. One of them was Calgary MacLeod, in fact, originally, asking that the church reconsider its stance around same-sex marriage and the implications of that for ordination, and those were the major issues, and the inclusion of 2S LGBTQI plus people within the denomination. That went through many different committees, studies, discussions, recommendations, a special former moderators committee, which has never been formed before in the church, was formed to consider this. And out of all of that came two decisions of the General Assembly in 2019. I think I've got the years right, with the missing times for the pandemic as well. But two decisions of the General Assembly, one to allow for same-sex marriage within the Presbyterian Church, but that congregations were not bound to have same-sex marriages. They could opt out. Second, that people in same-sex relationships could be ordained to the ministry of Word and Sacraments and as elders within the church. But that was a change to our doctrine. And so in our process, we have to go through something called the Barrier Act, which remits those decisions to the presbyteries, who have to vote on those decisions as well. And there were votes taken in presbyteries across the country. And in order to change doctrine, there has to be, I believe it's a 60% or 2/3 majority in favor both of the presbyteries, the number of presbyteries, and also the members in all of the presbyteries. So all of the votes that are taken, there has to be, maybe it's just a majority, a simple majority. Anyway, those went to the presbyteries, they were voted on, they were passed. They came back to the assembly last year, so the other part of the process is 2 assemblies have to vote in favor in order to change the doctrine of the church. The next assembly last year voted to approve the remits as well. And so they became part of the doctrine and the law of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And I would say that those 2 remits are really where the controversy has been, or the difference of opinion has been over many decades. And in fact, just a little aside from my personal opinion, again, I think those are issues that have been with us since the 1980s, and they were issues that were extremely important in the 1980s. If you talk to younger people now in the 2020s, the issues around sexuality and sexual diversity are very different from what it was in the 80s. So in a sense, in my opinion, we're kind of catching up with the issues that were there and have been there for a long time. Of course, there are people who are not in favor of that stance of the church. There was a test case, perhaps we could call it, in 1996, when Daryl MacDonald, who was in a same-sex relationship, was called by a church in Montreal. The presbytery agreed to ordain him by a slight majority. The General Assembly overturned that decision by a vote of 10-1. When the remits came last year, the vote was approximately 65 to 70% in favor. So there's been a big change within our church around understanding and belief around same-sex marriage and ordination. So there are people who although there are some options for congregations not to perform same-sex marriages, for ministers and elders not to attend the ordination and induction services of people who are in same-sex relationships. I won't say many, there are some congregations, some ministers, some Presbyterians who think that that's not enough, that we've strayed from orthodoxy, from correct doctrine in approving these. And that's where the controversy was at this past assembly, where the debate was, and primarily around if those people want to leave the denomination, what's the process to do that? How can that happen? In our polity, actually, it can't, it shouldn't happen. The property of any congregation ultimately belongs to the national church. It doesn't belong to the congregation or to the presbytery, but rather to the national church. If people want to leave, of course they're free to leave, but not to take the property or the resources with them. And that's been the polity since day one in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. This was discussed by the Assembly Council at length, and a formula was brought to the Assembly and a recommendation that if a congregation wanted to leave, if they could join another organization or form an organization that would have charitable status in Canada, if there were 2 votes taken within the congregation separated by a certain length of time, then, and had, I think it's 60% in favor, then the congregation would be able to leave and to take 50% of the assets with them. That might include the building, it might not, depending on what proportion of the assets the building represented. And for, again, many people who were at the assembly and many people within the church, that wasn't seen to be adequate. So there was a significant discussion around that recommendation. Most people who wanted to leave felt that they should have 100% of the assets. There were some people who agreed, and there were some people who argued that there shouldn't be any of the assets that are allowed to be taken by the group leaving. And in the end, the recommendation was approved. But that doesn't mean that everyone is in agreement, of course, on that. But that was one of the big debates. I think beyond that the recommendations of the Rainbow Communion are maybe seen by some, and I shouldn't put words into people's mouths, that's not my opinion, but it's seen by many as that these decisions were the first step along the way to challenging many other beliefs, doctrines, practices within the church. And at some level, I would say, just like I was saying about the 1994 confession to Indigenous people. These are the first steps along the way. And what the Rainbow Communion Report recommendations, many of them were about, were how we live out inclusion in our congregations, our presbyteries, our synods, General Assembly, in our relationships with each other, how we live that out, not just saying everyone is welcome, or not just saying God loves you, but rather to have a symbol at the door or the outside of the church that says to people, you're welcome here. That our worship would use language that includes others, doesn't exclude people around family, around gender. And that's where I think, some of where we're at now, and when I talk to younger people within the church, lots of discussion about gender, about gender fluidity, about transgender people. These things have really not been talked about in our church. And there's still much more to discuss and to come to terms with around inclusion. And so I would say in this assembly, there were a number of people in their comments who were alluding to that this is just a first step, and they're fearful, I think, of what next steps might be. I hope, again, I'll speak personally, I hope that my being able to speak with people across the country can say, I hold firmly to the belief that all people should be included, but I want to be in conversation with you, I want to sit with you, welcome you. This is your church, too. I for many years felt like the church really wasn't my church, because I didn't have a place. I didn't have a place at the table. If I had made public who I truly am, I would not have had a place at the table in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And I feel I do now. I don't want others to feel that they don't have a place. But that's hard. That's hard. We all have our beliefs. We all feel very convicted, or most of us very convicted about our beliefs. So I think that's where we're at. That's in the assembly where some of the difficult points were, and difficult points in the discussion, and where it will continue to be difficult as we move on. Long answer to it.
Thank you, Bob. Do we have other questions from the floor? Please feel free, come on up to the microphone and share your question. Come on up. As we have someone making their way, Bob, I was just thinking maybe a short follow-up to your question. You were alluding to the fact that sometimes it seems that the church is late coming to the conversation. The issues that we were just talking about going back to the 1980s. And certainly, there are those who would say, 40 years. And it's interesting when we had that debate that, there were those who kind of felt like the world was waiting for the answer of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Probably not the case. What would you say to those who say, really, it doesn't matter. Why should we deal with these things? The world has already moved on, and if we're out of step, why should we be bothering with these sort of issues in the church? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll answer, and then we'll get your question. I was just listening to Bruce Coburn on the way over, and I was thinking, 40 years in the wilderness. 40 seems to be an important number, biblically as well. It has been a long time. It's taken us a long time. I think we were surprised somewhat and didn't quite know what to do with the United Church decision in 1988. And I think that kind of hardened us a bit to say we have to hold to the traditional, what were considered to be the traditional views. The first thing I would say in response is to read the Rainbow Communion report in full. It's long, it's over 100 pages, but most of it is referencing the stories that 137 people told us as we traveled across the country. I was the co-convener of Rainbow Communion with Sue Sr. from Waterloo. And if we're asking why we should continue to deal with this, I would say read that report. Read about the harm that has been done to people's lives in our church, in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, including the things I mentioned earlier about young people now who statistics show that young people who are LGBTQI and in faith communities have higher rates of self-harm, of suicide, of substance abuse than others. Because they're most often told that who they are is abominable, is outside of God's love and purpose, and outside the love and purpose of their own faith community and even their families. So when you read those stories, and we heard the stories, I think we're compelled to do something about that. If we know that we're causing that kind of harm in people's lives, no matter what the United Church has done or what the world around us has done, we have to respond to that. We have to first of all really hear those stories of what life has been like for those of us who identify as LGBTQI in the church. And then think about what we do about that as a community. I think one of the big problems we've faced is that we've dealt with issues of human sexuality and gender identity and sexual orientation in terms of doctrine, in terms of debate. How many committees, how many studies have we done? But have we sat down together to talk and to hear and to listen? And to me, in my experience, it's talking with people, and for many of us, it's the coming out process when you have to tell your parents that you're gay. You can't do anything else but tell them, because it's destroying the relationship if you don't tell them. That's when there's a different relationship. I'm not saying everybody changes and accepts, but it's hard to think the same way when it's your son or your daughter who's telling you that they're gay, that they don't feel welcome in the church or even in their school or anywhere else. It's when your colleague who you've worked with for 50 years finally tells you that they're lesbian. Or when you find out that someone who has appeared as a man for 30 years, you've known and loved that person, is now appearing as a woman. What do you do with that? They're the same person. They're the person you love, care for, respect. So you have to know who they are. And I think maybe we've put the cart before the horse a bit, because if that had been the process earlier on, I think we would have grown a lot more. And as I say, in my experience, that's when I came out to my parents, when I came out to my best friend, when I came out to people in my congregation, and how difficult that was, and the fear that that I might be exposed or rejected or thrown out or whatever it might have been. That's hard. That's really hard, and it's hard for people on the other side to hear, but we have to do that. We have to listen. We have to talk with each other. So that's what I would say is the reason that we need to keep going. I'm concerned about doctrine and polity, of course, but I think the relationships, and I think that's where our faith and the gospel leads us into loving relationship with our neighbors. That's what we're called to do, God and our neighbors. Sorry.
Thank you, and please come up. Just a reminder to those who are watching by live stream, it's very easy to submit a question. If you have one, you simply type into the live chat the way you would to say hello. Leave your question there, and we will see that it's brought to the floor. Please.
Thanks. If you're willing, I would like you to comment on Jean Vanier. Jean Vanier was an amazing person who opened up a whole different way for my family and I to look at handicapped people, and then how hurt and shocked we were when we saw that he had a dark side as well. So yeah, this dichotomy of extremely good and extremely bad things.
Thank you. Jean Vanier was one of my Canadian heroes, I have to say, and I think for many people was just an example of love and inclusion and justice at work. And like you, sorry, I don't know your name.
Charles.
Charles, like you, Charles, I was absolutely shocked when I heard the news about his abuse and that had happened. It seemed impossible to me when I first heard the news. Unfortunately, we've heard that with many people over the last decade, let's say, more and more. I think the Me Too movement has exposed many people who in the past were able to kind of live under the radar around the things that they had been doing. And it's, any kind of abuse is connected with power, always, and power over people. And when you have that power, it opens the door to abuse. And it's happened with ministers in our church. It's happened with other leaders, and in pretty well every church. We're shocked by what we hear about what happened in the residential schools, and yet we probably shouldn't be if we think about the fact that people were allowed to function without any accountability for their personal actions. They weren't held accountable in any way. And that, again, opens the door to this kind of action and abuse. I think it points to the fact that in any organization, we need to have methods to hold people accountable. And in that instance, it might have seemed ludicrous to say Jean Vanier needs to go through an annual check, or there needs to be some way to hold him accountable for all that he's been doing, because he's just such a wonderful man. How could he do that? And yet we know that the truth is that he did some terrible things. It speaks to our humanness, to our fallenness, to the way that any of us who are given too much power without accountability can fall into that situation. I'm hopeful that the kinds of ways that we're trying to hold people accountable, even so though they seem a bit over the top sometime or awkward, with our Leading with Care policy, for example, we sometimes kind of joke about, well, do you really need another person in the room with that Sunday school teacher who's been teaching kids for 30 years and is the nicest person in the whole world? Well, we do. We do need it. And it's for the protection of that person as well as the protection of everyone else. And I just think we need to continue to do that. We need, like in so many other ways, we need to be aware. And we need to be honest that these things happen. I feel awful for the L'Arche community and for the people directly impacted by his actions. And there's a huge healing process, as with any organization if this happens, but huge within the L'Arche community with people who are so vulnerable, and so at risk, and depend so much on the integrity and the honesty of others. So I'm deeply sorry, like so many other people, that it's happened. It points us to accountability, I think.
Yes. Please, another question from the floor.
I want to say that I was really struck by the change in tone that happened partway through this. We spent the first part talking about the number of people that have to vote on a remit and how many years they have to do it. And if the whole congregation wants to leave, what's the percentage of splitting up the goods, and who's had arguments over this and that. And I remember this is the first Presbyterian church where I sort of consciously listened to anything. And it used to be said around here that the Presbyterian church, it's the thinking church with the caring heart. And Martin Luther King used to talk about tough mind, caring heart. And it seems to me as Presbyterians, we spend most of our meetings and most of our sermons and most of our other things speaking to the thinking part. How are we going to get to the caring part? The listening is the one thing, but how do we as a church say, discernment is a big thing now, and of course we're supposed to be discerning for ourselves where we should be going, but usually we're trying to discern what everybody else should be doing. How do we say, stop discerning and just start loving people? How can we do that in the Presbyterian Church?
Okay, I don't know whether I can be excommunicated as the moderator or not, but I totally agree with you. I think we spent far too much time here and not enough time here. From my own journey, I'll say, I felt I had to do this in order to keep moving on the process, not just for me, but for others who are LGBTQI. And I'm a good Presbyterian. My parents were both elders. I've always been Presbyterian in a Presbyterian church. I was leader in the Presbyterian Young People's Society. But yeah, we tend to always go here, and I think it's a way of avoiding heart stuff. I think our Indigenous siblings can teach us something. I was moved on Monday when we sat in a circle in Grace Church, the basement of Grace Church. It has several basements, I think. It's a big church. But anyway, we were in a basement room sitting in this very large circle with a whole variety of people who were there. And we had to listen those of us who are from the settler community had to listen in that instance. We had an opportunity to speak, and to speak our own truth or our own perspective as well, but primarily we were there to listen. I think that would have great power in many of our congregations if we just sat in a circle and talked to each other about who we are. Even the question, what does your faith mean to you, I think it goes up here. But what are the experiences we've had in our lives that demonstrate the truth of the gospel to us? That we're called into these loving communities, what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community. That's who we're supposed to be. What are the experiences in this community that hold us here, that make us followers of Jesus, or part of the body of Christ, or part of the beloved community? Why do we do it? I think part of it is the transition we're making from longing for Christendom, longing for 1950s to return. That's, for many of us, that was the glory time of our church and of all churches in Canada. They were, as we remember it, they were filled, the Sunday schools were filled, everything was booming. There were lots of people who volunteered for committees. We had women who would make church suppers every other week and do fundraising. We're not there. It's taken a long time to move forward. Yeah.
We had a little of that conversation in the mission course. You know, we used to have Christendom, and now we don't have Christendom, and a book was brought up about what we're up against and so on. But what you were describing sounds to me also, this is very unpopular, so I don't think I can get excommunicated either, I hope. But it reminds me of MAGA. Make America Great Again, you know, the good old days when white middle-aged men kind of could do what they want. And if you look at what's happened since the women stopped making casseroles with potato chips on the top and actually got to be elders and ordained, things are much better for them. Things are much better for people of color. Things are much better for people with different sexual orientations now than we were then. And so yearning for that, like I worry about the parallels to Make America Great Again.
Thank you. I do too. And I would say I hope we're moving from that, from longing for that. That for many years, I think, as the church so-called declined, certainly in number, that was the vision we had. But I think we need to sit in a circle with everybody, and everyone's voices being heard. I sometimes am still surprised in Presbyterian meetings when we can have a meeting and out of a group of 20 people, 3 people speak and dominate the whole meeting. It's the way we do things. But if we sit in a circle, and often that means having a talking stick or something, or even just learning to respect that the person can talk until they're finished. And if they don't want to talk, they don't have to talk. But allowing everyone to have a place in the circle, and I think in Christian terms at the table, we've shifted a lot, and I think we need to continue to shift in our thinking about the Sacrament of Communion and what it means for us. As we were going through the discussions about around human sexuality in the Church Doctrine Committee, we got stalled when we started talking about communion and saying, could we just say that everyone's welcome at the table? And we couldn't say that. And I think from my belief, my experience more, that I truly believe what we say at the beginning of a communion service, that this isn't the table of the Presbyterian Church in Canada or this congregation or of anyone else here. It's the table of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that means all are welcome. All are called. None of us have a special privilege to be there. And much can happen when we experience that in that way. I think there, just in this visit, and as I've been listening to people across the country, there are some churches, some presbyteries, some congregations that are really starting to say, we need to be different from what we've been. We need to be a community of people who loves each other, who supports each other, and who challenges each other. There's a lot that still needs to be challenged in the way we do things. We're still very much a product of patriarchy and of the way that the world has been organized, and the people who are in power are the people who are usually in power. And we need, I think, if you read the Gospels, you read about a very different kind of community that came into being around Jesus, and many of whom some people thought shouldn't be there because they weren't the right kind of people. It's a little teaser for the sermon tomorrow morning, but I think I'll use this. No, I just that we're welcome. We're welcome in the church, and I think the decisions that have been made, and going back also to the ordination of women into leadership roles, and not in the role that they were cast in an earlier time, points us to continue to live that out, to say, what does that mean? Women and men need to talk together, honestly. And gay and straight people and white and BIPOC people need to talk together. That's what we need to do. Mm-hmm.
I think maybe Greg was going to say one last question, so here we go. In the last, say, 4 or 5 years, there's been so many things happen to change society. The pace of change has been really fast and rapid and really ugly and uncomfortable at many times. And every once in a while I've heard somebody say, and these would be people of faith, I've heard somebody say, well, maybe it's God's way of making a new world. You know, we've been much more comfortable about talking about racism, diversity, all of the wrongs that have been done to our Indigenous peoples. And it seems sometimes when you see the news, hear the news, it seems like a really angry and troubled and unhappy and violent world. Sometimes on those really deep, discouraging days, it can be, where is God? And is God actually making something new? So I guess I'm just thinking a little bit big picture here, and I'm wondering if, you know, what signs do you see that God might be making a new world? And this isn't a test. It's just a what if kind of question. And
Do you think that there's a possibility that 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now we'll be able to look back, or maybe some of us who are around will be able to look back and say God really was doing something new with the church and for society? So it doesn't have to be a long answer, but just a thought. Thank you.
I hope you're realizing I do give fairly long answers. Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about this in conversation with someone yesterday, and it's hard to see God at work, I think, in our current situation, in many of the things we face each day, in the growing violence, both in our own country and internationally. It seems to be growing again, and war and preparing for war seems to be the answer that we're all saying. Being at war and preparing for war. Still not hearing me? Okay, I get a little more volume? Is that better?
Yep.
Is that better? Getting there a little more? Don't want to blow you away, but it alarms me to hear about a growing arms race, that's the solution to the problem. And in our own country, when we think about the pushback that's sometimes violent, not always, but sometimes violent in our own country on certain people or certain ways of thinking that have helped us in the journey recently. I think this is in response to some of the major changes that have been made around inclusion of other people and the in leadership and that sort of thing. I think in many ways we're living in a world that is reverting back to authoritarian and fascist ways of thinking and being. And that's very frightening. And we hesitate to say that. But I think if we're not already there, there's great possibility that will be where we are. And I've been thinking of some of my thinking and talking and conversations over the years of how important in Scripture the experiences of Exodus and of exile have been in the life of Israel and in what the Bible says to us. The Bible, in large part, as we know it, came out of the experience of the Babylonian exile, where people had to really think about what their faith meant to them in a context where they weren't in charge. And I've thought a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his work, and if you haven't read The Cost of Discipleship, it's a classic text, and it's not really quite in our context anymore, but I think it's incredibly important for the church today. Or to read something about the struggle of the churches in South Africa at the time of apartheid. I think we can learn from those, and it's in those situations of exodus and exile where people met God, and this is a teaser for tomorrow, met God in the strangest of places. To find God when we're present with someone who's being beaten on the street, and you have to be the person who's standing there only when you know that God is standing beside you as well. That God in Christ has experienced that. The church in Canada hasn't had that deep experience of exile, I don't think. We've been in charge. We've been the ones with some power and influence. It's when we're in those situations where we have to make some pretty difficult decisions, is that we can know that God is present with us because God has been there when we read the gospel. And that doesn't mean everything's going to be okay. It doesn't mean that God's going to swoop down and just change this, or that we're going to know God's presence in the way that we've known God's presence in the past. We're in a different context. But I think the church in Canada, Presbyterians and others, is called to be present in a prophetic way and to find God in that prophetic stance. You know, the Old Testament prophets often wondered where God was. Where are you? You've called me to do this stuff and to stand up against the king, or to call out injustice, or to say that people's worship is worthless. And I'm there kind of on my own and wondering where you are now. I think we can find God, or God will find us, or God is already present in the midst of that kind of experience. But it's different from what we've known. And and maybe even more so as the small minority groups that we are now, that's where we can often find God present with us.
Well, Kathy, you were right. That was the last question. But Bob, I want to thank you for what I think has been a very meaningful conversation with the moderator this afternoon, for those who are here and those who were logging in online. I also want to thank Heather for, thanks for that little plug there, Heather, that this was the first Presbyterian church where you actually found yourself listening to what was being said, and we hope that's maybe still the case here at VAPC. Of course, Heather is an elder at Westminster Presbyterian Church. Bob will be speaking there at the 10:30 service tomorrow morning, and then, of course, joining with other leaders and members of affirming faith communities here in Calgary to provide a presence at the Pride Parade. It has been our pleasure, on behalf of the Presbytery of Calgary McLeod, to have the moderator here with us, and we wish you the best for the remainder of your time in Calgary, Bob. For those who are here, there will be some refreshments afterwards, so please come and have some further conversation with the moderator, perhaps in a little less formal format. But again, thank you very much, moderator.